Hello and welcome. Today I'm joined by Linda Crane, who is a force in the legal world. Having spent 25 years as a law professor, she's built a powerhouse estate planning and probate firm. With a high-level background, including experience at Merrill Lynch and Stearns, she now focuses her expertise on helping families navigate the complexities of legacy planning. We are going to explore how Linda has exercised total agency over her career, her no-drama approach to probate, and her surprisingly bullish outlook on using AI to supercharge legal expertise. We will also dive into why she believes estate planning is a luxury deliverable that every family deserves. Linda, welcome to the Growth Switch.
Thanks, Alexei.
Now, let's start with the beginning of your career in academia. Take us back to what drew you to that career initially and what became the switch that made you go and start your own firm.
Okay, well, I started law teaching, which was my very first time in any kind of teaching role in the fall of 1980. And I was recruited by some of the members of the board of the law school who had approached the dean of the law school, which was the John Marshall Law School at the time. It's now the University of Illinois Chicago Law School. They had approached the dean about diversifying the faculty because there had never been any minority person on the full-time faculty, a tenure track. And so I was a vice president at Bear Stearns at the time and kind of, interested in going back onto the legal side. I went to business school and law school at the same time. And so I have been spending quite a bit of my time, my career, several years on using my MBA more than the law degree. And I kind of decided I wanted to use my law degree more. And I ran into someone and asked me what I was doing. I told them, and they said, we hear John Marshall's looking for some faculty. And I thought, well, I was impressed because that person who told me could have applied for it. So, I thought it was flattering that they thought I should. And so one thing led to another. And so I pursued it and, went through channels. My husband was friends with the president of the Alumni Association, really just used my connections to pull that thread. But what was interesting, I would say, is that a couple of things that I had been doing I didn't even know were preparing me for it. One was I had been reading all these novels set in the border between Wales and England, the Brother Cadfael series, and all of the characters were heavily steeped in feudalism.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I was interviewed to teach, they needed somebody to teach property law, which is US property law is very much a continuation of British common law and property. So a lot of my preparation for teaching property law had come from reading these books about people in feudal England,
Right.
these novels. And also, when I had been in law school years prior, I had an African American law professor, a female law professor named Joyce Hughes. And at the time, she was one of two African American female law professors with tenure in majority law schools in the United States, the whole country. And so I was in a position to, observe her, and I benefited from being able to see her. There was this member of the Illinois Appellate Court, Justice Eugene Pincham, years and years ago. He used to say, if you can see it, you can be it. And so, I saw her, and when the opportunity came, I can honestly say that the only reason I had any notion that this was something I could actually do was because I had seen somebody else do it. And so I used to, sort of channel Professor Hughes every time I walked into, the classroom. And so I was hired to teach in the commercial law area. And I went there from being a vice president at Bear Stearns, and I'd been trained on Wall Street by Merrill Lynch. And I, as I said, had gone to business school as well before, at the same time I went to law school.
Mm-hmm.
And so then they said, well, we also need somebody to teach property. So that was fall of 89, and I taught my courses, got tenured. I was the first African American woman to get tenure at the school in 1994. And then I got my promotion to full professor in 2000. And that was really the last promotion on that track
Mm-hmm.
in law professors in the United States. Job description involves three things: teaching, writing, community service. And it's not until you're a full professor that they really expect you to engage in a lot of community service. But
Hmm.
I had been very involved in volunteerism my entire life, so I had been using, taking advantage of that from day one. But I was still relatively young, I was still relatively ambitious, and I had gotten to the end of the promotion track in being a law professor with tenure and full professor status, and which was great. I would teach anywhere from 4 to 7 hours a week for 7.5 months out of the year. And the
Hmm.
rest of the time I had to myself. And the rest of the time, when I had that time to myself, I was on all these boards and gala committees and museums in Chicago and fundraising and, on a bully pulpit telling lawyers they should focus on estate planning in the Black community and all this. And no one cared about it the way I did. And so I
Hmm.
decided that I would do it. And so actually, 9/11, of course, was September 11th, 2001.
Hmm.
I had been a full professor for about a year, looking around, trying to think of what I might do next. And right before 9/11, I had led a delegation of 12 people to the island nation of Cuba. And we did a revolutionary tour, which covered the tracks that Fidel Castro covered when he left home going to Havana to go to law school. It's called the Revolutionary Tour because he lived at
Hmm.
one end of the island and Havana was at the other.
Hmm.
And it was very, very interesting and I mean, just life changing. And I remember just being so impressed by the people there and about how they had so little in terms of material goods, and the poverty was striking, and they had just come out of the special period, but there was no sense of them being depressed. There was no sort of downtrodden third world depression there. They were like, very
Hmm.
well educated and upbeat. And when 9/11 happened, shortly after I got back, I found myself sort of pulling from the spirit of the Cuban people to cope with what was going on because everybody had to find some kind of way to cope with it.
Right.
And so, one other thing that happened was that we started thinking more broadly. We stopped feeling confined by the, walls of whatever box we were in. Not unlike, some of the young men who may have, enrolled in the army or volunteered to go fight. Lots of people did lots of things. And one of the things that I decided, since I had already got my last promotion, uh, I decided that I wanted to practice law more.
Hmm.
And so I had a lot of responsibilities to my employer, but I had a lot of free time. So all of the things that I had been spending my free time on, I kind of set aside and what I called harvested my
Hmm.
time, and I started a law firm. And actually, I was of counsel at two different firms first, working with estate planning founders who invited me to come into their firms and be of counsel and sort of learn the ropes and bring in business, which is what I did. And I'm still close to them and I really valued the opportunity that they gave me. But I got to the point where about 5 years later, hung out my own shingle and started Crane Law Group in July of 2007.
Hmm.
But I had been building my own book of business from day one. So the book of business that I had when I started my own firm was what I had built. It wasn't anything I had gotten from the other firms.
Right.
And so it's the same book of business I have today that I've built on. Next month, April of 2026, I'll be celebrating my 24th anniversary of Crane Law Group, which was always focused on looking at the sort of thesis that I, as a law professor, had sort of developed, which was because of my community activism, my desire to be active. I don't like just talking about stuff. I can talk about something for about 5 minutes and then I want to
Hmm.
know what are we doing. And so I had decided in my own way, can't say I determined it, but I do believe it's true, that there was a reason why more African American families were not engaging in organized estate planning and having conversations with lawyers about actually creating legal documents that would allow them to pass their instructions along to their future to their
Hmm.
future descendants, or even to other organizations or friends, all of which require you to have something in writing. And I also felt that the fact that we weren't doing that as a community was a direct contributor to the intransigence of poverty from one generation to the next, insofar as every generation starts from scratch. And I had grown up in Chicago, in what I would guess would be called a middle class background. My father was a fire chief when he retired, and I always knew people who had a certain amount of resources, but every generation started from scratch, and you just can't get ahead that way. And so that's why I really felt that it was important, because a lot of other of my colleagues who were also community activists and community spirited didn't have the background and the skill sets that I had. They had
Hmm.
other skill sets and other things that in their backgrounds that I didn't have, that allowed them to be very effective in fighting things like police brutality and sex trafficking, and
Hmm.
God knows all kinds of other, issues exist. But in my particular case, I have been dealing with, economic and commercial issues that I really felt prepared me to see the connection between the same sorts of results of oppression and lack of certain sorts of ability to advance, to the lack of this sort of planning. And I
Hmm.
was comfortable with the subject matter in a way
Hmm.
that a lot of lawyers were not. So I took it on.
And the rest is history, as they say.
Yeah, the rest is history. For 12 years, when I was still teaching after I started my law firm. So I've only been retired from law teaching for about 12 years. The time has passed, but my firm is 24 years old. And
Hmm.
that's because for the first 12 years of the firm, I did both. And I had two offices in downtown Chicago. Sometimes I'd be driving from home down Lakeshore Drive toward the Loop, and I wasn't sure which office I was going to. Now, if
Hmm.
I had a class, I knew I was going to school. If I had a client meeting, I knew I was going to the law office. But if I didn't, I kind of wasn't sure. And so I'd park my car and then decide which office to go to, because I never practiced law out of my law school office. I had two offices, and I, just always said that it was just easier to do it than not do it. People would
Hmm.
say, "How did you do it?" And all I could say is, it just must have been easier to do it than to not do it.
I think it's probably very strong motivation to have that calling because you saw things differently, you were knowledgeable about it, and you knew how to do it. That experience that you have, how do you look at the younger attorneys nowadays? Because obviously they want to have more balanced work-life situation, and it might be hard for them to imagine to do something that requires such a strong time commitment to both teach and then run your own practice at the same time.
Yeah, probably. I mean, I've always known law professors are often engaged in practice at some level, and we usually called it consulting.
Hmm.
Uh, but it's usually done kind of on a very infrequent basis, and they would do it out of their offices at the law school. They wouldn't necessarily hang out a shingle and start an actual business, a law firm as such.
Hmm.
They may act as expert witnesses or consultants with larger firms or banks or whatever. It's not, we have a lot of time. They do have a lot of time, as I described. And unlike a lot of the time when I would be spending my extra time on, you know, uh, uh, community service and volunteer activities, a lot of law professors do spend their time, professionally engaged.
Hmm.
So that in of itself is not that unusual, but it is
Hmm.
more unusual for them to actually just hang out a shingle and declare that you're open for business,
Hmm.
and really kind of keep it totally separate from the law school. It might not be as uncommon right now. So much has changed since the pandemic, and the way that we work so differently now. I do think that one big thing that has changed, though, since I started in the estate planning work I do as a lawyer, is that when I started 24 years ago, As you said, I had this perspective
Mm-hmm.
and a driver and vision of a connection between a problem and a pain point and my involvement and a solution.
Mm-hmm.
But it had nothing to do really with the main driver for most attorneys to practice estate planning.
Mm-hmm.
Back then, the main reason why most attorneys were practicing estate planning was because they were tax experts. They were focusing primarily on the needs of super wealthy families to avoid paying estate and gift taxes, which,
Mm-hmm.
as a category is probably the most highly taxed area, in our tax system. The estate and gift tax is, on average about 40%, can be more.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the exclusion rate, which is the amount of a deceased person's estate that is not subject to estate and gift tax, was much lower then than it is now.
Mm-hmm.
But even at the lower rate, there was, well, I should say not even, because of the much lower exclusion rate,
Mm-hmm.
there were many more families that were exposed to the risk of paying death taxes then than there are now. So since then, the exclusion rate has, exploded to $13 million or so per person. And there's a way for that first, for the entire amount of deceased assets, way over the $13 million. Even Warren Buffett, if he were to die, he could leave his entire estate to his surviving spouse
Mm-hmm.
tax free because of the portability feature in federal gift tax structure. Now, at the death of the second spouse, all bets are off, right? But my point is that the combined exclusion rate for a couple now is over $26 million. So even though lawyers 24 years ago were saying all my clients have $50 million, like they're all so rich and all this, they were
Mm-hmm.
lying, right? And we know they're lying because when the exclusion rate started going up,
Mm-hmm.
they got out of the business. Their business dried up. Their
Right.
business wouldn't have dried up if their clients were as wealthy as they were saying that they were, because those folks at that level still needed their work.
Mm-hmm.
So my clients were never uh, super wealthy. They weren't even wealthy in those terms of 24 years ago, where the exclusion rate may have only been $1 million or, a
Mm-hmm.
few $1 million. So I was always uh, uh, the person who was talking to people about all of the non tax related important reasons for
Mm-hmm.
engaging in this planning. And so over time, the tax wonks have sort of abandoned estate planning in the numbers that they were in before. There's still a sufficient number of them for the very wealthy.
Mm-hmm.
But as sort of in terms of the sheer numbers of lawyers who want to do tax work, they're not really looking at estate planning for that now. They're looking elsewhere for that. Sort of change that is, I think, a good thing is that the I think the exclusion rate being as high as it is a good thing, of course, but and it has never gone down, even when we thought that, Obama or other presidents might lower the exclusion rate.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they haven't done it, and there doesn't seem to be any real sign that it's going to be going down. But the lawyer who's now really going into estate planning is more like I was 24 years ago. It's more like I am.
Mm-hmm.
Someone who is sort of drawn to that work for non tax related reasons, for the purpose of helping families, for the purpose of listening to stories and to designing solutions and understanding, ways through to solutions. Because one of the things that I really, really love the most about this area that, is really a good fit for me temperamentally is that there are answers.
Mm-hmm.
I love the fact that there are answers. I don't like, you know, vagaries and uncertainties. I feel that, vagaries and uncertainties really tend to be a further disadvantage for disadvantaged people.
Right.
The more vague something, it's like no. And so I really like that there are answers.
Mm-hmm.
You're talking about assets and taking inventory of a person's assets on the day that they die and looking at
Mm-hmm.
what the things are that have to be done to those assets or with those assets in order to get them out of a person's estate or to distribute them according to the terms of a trust or whatever. Those are doable. And even if there are disputes, the parties are pretty free to agree to a resolution.
Mm-hmm.
The law is pretty dominant in the area. Lots of statutes. Every state has different laws in the United States. The judges are quite amenable to parties agreeing to a different outcome than what the law might dictate if they can't agree.
Mm-hmm.
I like the fact that I can actually I can actually brainstorm with the family. I can actually sort of almost guarantee them that if they are transparent with me and they allow me to represent the entire group,
Mm-hmm.
that if they trust me, then I can help them through it. That I can get them from where they are in pain, grieving over the loss of a second parent, let's say if it's a group of adult siblings, which is a class of clients that I really do
Mm-hmm.
uh, like working with because I can just really help them so much. I mean, there's estate planning and there's probate. A lot of estate planning attorneys don't also do probate. Probate generally refers to what's required as court supervised administration of assets that were basically not in trust. There's trust based estate planning that can be handled quite privately
Mm-hmm.
and again can really give you a lot of opportunity to leave instructions that give you control into the distant
Mm-hmm.
future. And people love control, and uh, so it's very rewarding. I like to tell my clients, look, you guys go work on your relationships. Ask me the tough questions. I will answer them for you. If I don't know the answer immediately, I'll find out the answer. But one thing I can almost guarantee them is that there is an answer. And so to be able to come in and be almost like a referee to a certain
Mm-hmm.
extent after I hear what their concerns are, and I can tell them, look, don't worry about whether your brother or your sister is getting more or less. Let's just see what your parents' instructions were.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that people are pretty willing to go along with what the instructions were that were left.
Mm-hmm.
The lack of instructions can cause a lot of problems.
Right.
And most importantly, the lack of information causes problems. The inability to get answers to reasonable questions
Mm-hmm.
can be really at the root cause of a lot of disharmony that can erupt in a family. And so I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a priest, I don't have any, superpowers when it comes to really anything.
Mm-hmm.
But I am a really good listener and I understand this area. I'm eager to hear the most convoluted story. And so I can't really cure deep dysfunction.
Mm-hmm.
That's not my space, okay? But what I have found is that a lot of perfectly lovely people in families who are grieving in crisis and forced out of their regular routines in order
Mm-hmm.
to come together to deal with wrapping up their parents' affairs for parents who may have very much always been very private and non-sharing,
Mm-hmm.
about this information. Plus, of course, they're usually going to be receiving some kind of, distribution, so they're properly motivated. But they're not bad people. They're not highly dysfunctional.
Mm-hmm.
They're just, ordinary people in what is unfortunately an ordinary situation, but it's a tough situation. Even with planning, it's not easy to deal with these things. And yet, even these lovely families can completely disintegrate because there has been resentment and other difficulties that they can find it very
Hmm.
hard to recover from because of one thing that didn't happen, and that was that they did not get answers to reasonable questions. And so I can
Right.
come in and offer them answers to those reasonable questions and hopefully prevent that family from falling apart or even
Hmm.
having the resentments develop or any even disharmony.
Clarity and, like you said, control, the sooner they arrive to it, the better they will be. I want to go back to something that you said earlier because of your background, both from the legal world but also from the business world. When you first started your practice and you said that you built your book of business, it wasn't something that was handed to you, it's something that you had to build from scratch, and this is still what you do today. What were you doing maybe differently to a typical law firm because you had that, first of all, drive and the mission that you wanted to pursue, but also because of your business background?
Well, I do think that one reason why more lawyers don't do estate planning is because they suffer from what is a really common sort of ailment
Hmm.
among lawyers in the United States. I don't know about elsewhere, which is that they have a fear of numbers, and they don't really like, anything that requires them to deal with a number at all, to even read a
Hmm.
number. And we're just talking about in these cases, because like I said, I'm not even, although tax isn't really financial, frankly, but I would say that the numbers that you deal with in estate planning and probate are there. It's not even math. It's arithmetic, you
Hmm.
know. And so even with that though, they're just freaked out. Even though they might be really good transactional attorneys who do a lot of work with contracts and so forth, and of course there's a lot of similarity between estate planning documents and contracts,
Hmm.
but at least for purposes of drafting and understanding how it works, there's the framework. But I do think that's part of it. I didn't have that fear of numbers, although I did when I went to business school. I mean, I credit Northwestern Business
Hmm.
School with getting me over the fear of numbers. I mean, they totally deserve credit, for
Hmm.
that, because I was totally typical law student and person preparing to go to law school. And so far as I really, just avoided that. Although I did love algebra when I was in high school. I kind of always enjoyed solving for X. I kind of got that,
Right.
but I hated accounting and all that. But I think that, as I said, the shift away from the tax skill focused or focus of estate planning practice has ushered in a lot of interest among lawyers today.
Hmm.
I get a lot of young lawyers or lawyers who I even encounter who aren't necessarily new to whatever their practice is. They may be working inside of corporations or hospitals and have a lot of experience thinking about going into private practice. A lot of them are thinking about going into estate planning.
Hmm.
And so they'll ask me, can I call and talk about the practice and how to start and what the tools are that I use and just, but their interest is already there. And I think that is because of the sort of thorough change away from tax that we've seen in estate planning. Again, it's not to say that there aren't still a lot of tax wonks in estate planning, but I will say that the tax wonks who are in estate planning today also have these other soft skills that were considered soft skills.
Hmm.
They're much more well-rounded than the focused attorneys of the past who were practicing in the area. Now there are attorneys who they're okay with basic arithmetic,
Hmm.
and they're confident that the practice uh, focuses more on relationship management and, application of the statutes. They're lawyers. They're comfortable with the statutes. They're comfortable with that whole idea. In fact, I love, even when I was in law school, like I told you, I don't like vagaries. So when I was in law school, I used to gravitate toward code courses. Anything
Mhm.
like there was the Uniform Commercial Code or anything with an actual statutory
Right.
focus, I loved because the answer was in the book. The answer was there.
Mhm.
I just had to find it, as opposed to some of these other sort of subjects where you know the professor had all of this sort of discretion over whether
Mhm.
he liked what I was saying or not. So
Right.
a lot of the things that there's a lot to recommend it. And I'd say number one thing that makes it kind of special
Mhm.
is that 100% of the population needs it.
Right.
So if you're going to, I don't know, face a challenge to get into an area of the law that may or may not, or let's say may not be your cup of tea totally,
Mhm.
at least the fact that you won't have to worry about clients
Mhm.
should offset any kind of, reluctance you may have. You can uh, work hard and go up against the grain and still be sort of, finding clients. It's like, looking for hen's teeth.
Mhm.
But in the case of estate planning, 100% of the population needs it. 100% of people are going to die. 100% of people have
Mhm.
family who they are concerned about planning for. 100%.
Right.
Uh, they don't all, and they're all quite unique. So you have to kind of be comfortable with that too. There's answers. The answers are often a result of fairly standard formulaic approaches or application of statutes, which helps. But you
Mhm.
have to be able to know how to listen to your clients and empathize with them and have some sort of a comfort with being in the weeds,
Mhm.
as I say, to really know which of these tools to bring to the situation for a solution. So, there are answers and fewer vagaries, but the fact is that, are you frozen?
No, I'm still here. The image disappeared, but it might be a
Okay, I
connection.
think the same.
We're
I should
back.
stop moving my hand so much. Okay, I'm sorry. On the one hand, there are fewer vagaries and so forth, but on the other hand, there's a lot of variety in the stories. It's all about the story, right? It's
Mhm.
all about listening. Like I tell my clients, it's your plan. It is not my plan, right?
Mhm.
I could not design this plan for you if you don't open up to me, if you don't tell me what's really bothering you, if you don't tell me what you're most concerned about, because pretty much nothing's off limits.
Mhm.
This is your plan based on your life, based on your vision of the future,
Mhm.
into the distant future for your family, for your children and grandchildren and great grandchildren. Let it rip.
Mhm.
You can do that. And so you can't be stuck at the same time that you're quite comfortable with applying the rules,
Mhm.
right? But again, the rules are going to get applied, but the outcome and the level of satisfaction that the client experiences. For instance, I had this one, it can be very different. I had this one very poignant experience. I was doing this estate plan for the 90 plus year old parents of some other clients. This was years ago. And I had actually gone to high school with one of the daughters and college with one of the others, and one of the daughters was married to a good friend of mine. All of my clients know each other.
Mhm.
And that's the other thing, like you have to be, you hear these stories, but you can't share them, right?
Right.
And so unlike much more so perhaps even than typical law practice, the information that you are entrusted with
Mhm.
is very personal and private information. And I literally forget that I know stuff, but
Mhm.
and my clients are all very comfortable with that. So anyway, as usual, and now the vast majority of my business are return clients or referrals from clients. And,
Mm-hmm.
it's really interesting how I spend my time now. But I finished the drafting. We had the signing meeting. A couple were there in my conference room, just the three of us, and we were all done. And I was congratulating them on, completing the planning process and so forth. Then we're going to start turning to talking about funding, which
Mm-hmm.
is a whole other topic. And the father, the gentleman, the husband, he stood up and he was, as I said, over 90.
Mm-hmm.
He was a little younger than the wife, who was even further into her 90s,
Mm-hmm.
but still very handsome, just like really handsome man. He was like really tall and very handsome, even at 90 plus. And he had like sort of this shadow over his face as he stood there about to leave, and we're done.
Mm-hmm.
And so I said, "Sir, is there anything that's wrong?" "No." I said, "You don't really look happy." And so he didn't really articulate this. I realized, though,
Mm-hmm.
that there was something that he had come to achieve when he first set out to do his estate planning that he felt had not been achieved.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started really kind of trying to drill down into that and to think about it. And even today, I always try to do this. And that is to try and find some way to get my clients' voices into their documents,
Mm-hmm.
particularly the trust, because the trust should not be this stranger to them, right? It should be a version of them.
Mm-hmm.
The more they live with it, the more comfortable they will get with it. But even on the signing day, you should feel some connection to it. And I just don't feel like he did.
Mm-hmm.
And so ever since then, raise this with clients and invite them, in fact, to compose as lengthy a statement as they'd like to include in their trust, like a statement of purpose and intent. And,
Mm-hmm.
and this would be a statement from them where they are actually sharing with their descendants
Mm-hmm.
information about themselves, information about their lives, information about why they did this planning, about what their hopes are for their descendants into the future, and how they hope that by understanding the ancestor better, that might provide some guidance to the descendants in the future, and,
Mm-hmm.
and, and then just have their sort of voice there. And sometimes even they may have given uneven gifts. They may explain why they are doing that. I've had people explain that I know that you may be concerned that I've given your sister a larger share, but this is why I did it. And the reasons vary wildly.
Mm-hmm.
But that's something that I really do care about. And again, listening and being able to sort of treat this as something that is a living thing that has a future can also help. Just sort of explaining to them that this is not a transaction really. This is a process.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're doing is embarking on a new relationship with this trust.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, assuming that it's a living trust as opposed to a testamentary trust, which doesn't spring into existence until a person dies in the will. But yeah, and I told them there's no right answer, there's no wrong answer. But there's lots of decisions that have to be made along the way that you have to sort of help people with. Who's going to be the fiduciaries? What are the different roles of fiduciaries under different documents and things like that? So you have to be comfortable in the weeds. You have to be a good listener. You also have to be a good explainer,
Mm-hmm.
which, I was a law professor for 25 years. So
Mm-hmm.
as I'm demonstrating here, I can just go on and on.
It's super interesting that, unlike some other parts of law, like you said, it's not just one event or one process, it's also form and intention behind it that makes it quite unique. In that regard, what do you think will be the future of estate planning with AI element? Because one of the things AI could offer is give voice to somebody that might not be around anymore, but their wishes and why they made certain decisions could potentially be there for their children or for their grandchildren to almost talk to and understand some of the decisions.
Yeah, I've actually been giving some thought to that. I've actually spent a lot of time studying AI for the last couple of years. If I were younger, I probably would pursue being an AI consultant or something, but,
Hmm.
I just don't have the desire really to do that. But I really do have a strong desire to demystify AI for my clients as much as possible and let them decide how they want to use it. I can give them some ideas, but again, most of my work with my clients done. I have a lot when I do for my estate planning clients. I have a living relationship with them,
Hmm.
and so we're in touch all the time. They call me about different things, they have different questions. And one of the things that I'm really excited about with AI and my own personal experience that I know is not unlike what my clients are also experiencing is how AI can really allow you to leverage whatever remaining stamina or energy that you have.
Hmm.
That you can do as much or more than you could when you were younger with a lot less energy using AI and to, troubleshoot issues around the house.
Hmm.
Or I just used AI this week to help me plan the menu for my husband's birthday dinner on Sunday.
Hmm.
And it did a fabulous job. I had a problem with my dishwasher
Hmm.
and the repair people couldn't figure it out what to do. And you can have 10 repair people come in, all 10 might know something different. All 10, not one of them is going to know everything that all 10 knows.
Right.
Right. And so AI gives you all of the expertise of every plumber who's ever lived.
Hmm.
And so I took a photo and I said, well, what's that little box? There was this little white box there. And we're pretty sure it has something to do with why the water wasn't coming into the dishwasher. And one guy said it has something to do with the new garbage disposal. I said, well, no, I don't think so. It kept going on and on and on. So I
Hmm.
took a photograph of this little white box under the sink. And I sent it up to ChatGPT and I
Hmm.
said, what is this? And so they said, well, that looks like this aqua valve shutoff that they have in Bosch dishwashers. I was
Hmm.
like, oh, I have a water shutoff problem.
Right.
And so, after that, kind of like, we were able to get it resolved. We weren't able actually to get it fixed, but at least we knew what the problem was. And
Hmm.
it was working, so that wasn't the problem. But because it has shut off the water. So everything from, decluttering your home, taking a photograph and asking ChatGPT, how can I declutter this room? How can I reorganize this? Just to allow people to have the abilities to remain active in a lot of areas that they may have stopped being active in because they just really don't have a lot of help, or don't have somebody in the house to sort of brainstorm with, or don't have the knowledge that they don't have access to going to the library like they used to, or whatever.
Hmm.
But also, I was just talking to somebody the other day about this, and she was saying that I should have a clone of myself to be able to talk to people and give them, answers to different questions. We've used holographic wills and things like that, along with the, language that I've asked people to include in their trust, which I do believe can result in some, I don't know, execution by the
Hmm.
trustee to the extent that's in the trust,
Hmm.
right? So if they're saying, because it becomes their purpose. So, given the choice of, we have trust protectors, which is a sort of a newfangled party to a trust here that can either be a fiduciary or not a fiduciary, whose primary responsibility is to protect the trust.
Hmm.
And I believe that and a lot of times we don't make the trust protector a fiduciary because we used to do so early on. And then there were some lawsuits brought by beneficiaries
Hmm.
against trust protectors who had made decisions on behalf of the trust that were detrimental to the beneficiaries.
Hmm.
And so if you make the trust protector a fiduciary, then they cannot make decisions that are adverse to the interests of the beneficiaries. So now I don't make the trust protector a fiduciary any
Hmm.
longer. But I do believe that, it's one thing for the trust protector to have, a paragraph or a two or a whole page of narrative from the grantor in real time
Hmm.
that's in the trust itself as guidance for what the interests of the trust are, as opposed to having it outside of the trust. So I do tend to put, what I can, if that's the objective, to put it into the trust. We really want their voices in the trust. On the other hand, video or even, like you said, animated imagery of the deceased is something that's possible
Hmm.
now. And it's not for everyone, but it's as we say, it's not illegal. And
Right.
so, it's also something that is available. But, a lot of my interest in AI may or may not have to do with the estate planning as much as it has to do with the way I like to sort of be have a really kind of organic relationship with my clients
Hmm.
and to become an honorary member of the family and to share information that I have and to, be a sounding board. And I want to do actually more and more of that and working with people who may not be in Illinois, which is where I'm licensed to practice law, but who I can, work with to conduct family meetings, to have those drill down sessions, and to strategize and come up with solutions that they can maybe work with other lawyers where they do live to achieve,
To implement makes absolute sense.
to implement exactly.
Is that your main goal for 2026 to do more of that kind of work and just expand your reach in terms of geography that you're impacting?
It really is, Alexi. It's something that I've been spending a lot of sort of time thinking about, agonizing over, even more than I agonized over starting my law practice back in 2002. It's one of those things that just, again, feels like it's got a life of its own, is sort of driving me. I still really enjoy the work that I do, but it's already changed. Already, it's like my typical day working with my clients. I'm working with people who I've worked with for 5 years, 15 years. I train my clients to understand the role that time plays
Hmm.
in reaching some of our objectives, and tactical approach really often requires patience.
Hmm.
And so, I don't have my clients sort of clamoring, like what's going on, like, chill. I'll tell you when to worry is my favorite line, and they trust me, and it does help my quality of life quite a bit.
Hmm.
There are things that are urgent that, come up. I've recently had a very kind of unusual experience where the only client I've ever agreed to act as trustee for,
Hmm.
because he said he had no family and I already was doing work for his deceased mother who had been my client. Really complicated situation. But he was a really good client. And I'm saying in the past tense because he died in
Hmm.
November. Unattended death in his home. A friend called me and said that he said if anything ever happened to him to call me. And she was concerned because she hadn't heard from him for a couple of days. No, for a couple of weeks.
Hmm.
And so I told her to call the police and do a wellness check. Did the wellness check. Fortunately, she had a key to the house. They found him. He was deceased, had been for 2 weeks or more.
Hmm.
I was his power of attorney in life, and I was also named as the executor in his will and the trustee of his trust.
Hmm.
And I had to plan his funeral. I chose the casket. I had to have the house, cleaned from the unattended death. Selected the, I knew where his parents were buried, so I went back to that cemetery and uh, completed the process there.
Hmm.
He got him buried, bought headstones for him and for his mother and his sister. There was already a headstone there for his father.
Hmm.
And all of this stuff. And of course, now, relatives are coming out of the woodwork.
Hmm.
This guy who had no relatives, all of a sudden there's relatives out of
Right.
the woodworks. I've got the mother's estate still being probated. her trust, irrevocable life insurance trust that I put with a different trustee. Now it's his estate and his trust. And there's different distributions under all these documents to different people, some of whom are family members, some of whom are not. All of whom are calling me,
Mm.
making my life an absolute nightmare to a certain extent. And none of whom are my clients, by the way.
Right.
And so, you know, how we are about, non clients being demanding. And yet, it feels like it was almost my destiny for something like this to happen, at some point. And I am just so actually, uh, in a way, grateful or not at all do I feel unhappy about having to do this because I just am so happy that I could do it for him.
Hmm.
And his family has actually been quite lovely to deal with. They're anxious, but they're being very cooperative. And I did something with them that I don't normally do. And that is, I told everybody who asked everything I knew about everything in the family,
Hmm.
you know. And I just figured, you know what? There is no, I don't have a basis for deciding who to tell what.
Hmm.
None of them really, some of them had more of a right to know some of the details than others, but I just really felt that in this situation where he had put me there to be the person who the family came to, because I didn't know he had family, but guess who did know? He knew, right? And so
Right.
he had put me into this position, and I felt that he wanted me to do what he would do. And so I just let all of my guards down, and any question they asked me, I answered it. Any of the background information about my, representation of him and his mother and so forth, I answered it. Any information about the trustees, which fortunately I was not trustee of the other trust, I answered it. And, I'm still in the process of managing this, but I feel like it is an example of what I was talking about before, which is that being able to get answers to reasonable questions is important for people. And if there was ever a situation that could go sideways,
Hmm.
it's this. And if I have to decide, and there's no harm being done to anybody by me oversharing, and I just tell everybody, the family members, whatever they want to know. And they just really seem to appreciate it. And I have found, and I've even connected the father side of the family with the mother side of the
Mm.
family and say, contact each other. Why don't you guys talk? I'm handling this over here. Just give me time and, trust me. And, I'll make sure you're going to get whatever you have coming. If there's a way for it,
Hmm.
or for me to make that distribution to you, you can count on me. It will happen.
Hmm.
And I really think that it's making a big difference in their level of comfort with the situations, all of which are fodder for a lot of conversation in the family. But I feel like I've brought a relative level of calm to the situation. And right now I am sort of getting them to appreciate the need to be patient and that, yes, it may take longer than you'd like for it to take, but when all is said and done, it'll be handled correctly.
Well, I think they are blessed to have you helping and managing that. For our closing remarks, Linda, like you said previously, 100% of people will need this, but not everybody is thinking about it. What would be your advice to families that haven't put in something in place or they haven't spoken to an attorney? What's the one thing they should keep in mind?
I think that one thing that families should do, without exception, is to open up the lines of communication within the family about the subject of future planning
Hmm.
and estate planning, and perhaps getting information before there's a crisis, which is one of the reasons why I'm sort of shifting my practice. Because as an attorney, as you know, no one hires an attorney before they need to do so. And yet, everybody, well, I won't say everybody, but a lot of people, when they have a crisis and they hire us, they'll tell you, I just didn't have, I wanted information, but I didn't know where to get it. And
Hmm.
so, I think that I'd like to play a role of a person who is not only dealing with a crisis situation that has already occurred, but also to help families know how to have family meetings, to have these conversations, to provide answers to the kinds of questions they may have that they don't have anybody to ask now. Even before reaching out to somebody like me, just to have a family meeting where, they kind of set aside the taboos about talking about death and
Mm-hmm.
death planning. Alexi, people spend the first, 18 years of their lives knowing chapter and verse what they're going to do to get through their educational journey.
Mm-hmm.
And whether or not after from 18 to 25, they're going to go on to graduate or professional school or start working. And then, they when they do start working, they have a plan for what they want to do in their careers and their trajectory and how they want to move through it. And then along the way, they decide to to start a family of their own and raise children and start planning those children's lives and all that. And then they get to retirement age, and a lot of that, timeline, although they have all this life left, their
Mm-hmm.
timeline ends as though they died for planning purposes. And so the, the muscles that we've been exercising all of our lives that tell us that planning is important,
Mm-hmm.
should be engaged to continue to do that kind of planning. But the
Right.
kind of planning that you're doing now is different than the kind of planning you may have done in the past, but it's still you and your life and the rest of and the next phase of your life that you're planning for.
Mm-hmm.
And if planning for that phase requires you to face your mortality or think about, it's hard to get used to the idea of having a shorter runway.
Mm-hmm.
Because so much of what we do in our planning, the planning is still kind of abstract, right? It's still kind of, not tangible. And so as wedded as we may be to the plan, we know that if the plan goes awry, we still have all this runway. Right, we'll come up with
Mm-hmm.
another plan. And I think that having been, getting older myself and dealing with people, who are getting older and wondering about why we stopped this planning,
Mm-hmm.
I think it has to do with that, that discomfort with not having as much of a future as you have a past. But, your past is what has, hopefully prepared you to appreciate how important it is to do this planning and to be a good role model and to control the things that you can control now
Mm-hmm.
and not just leave it to the vagaries of whoever crosses your path or let your kids deal with it, because I can tell you that that's the worst thing you can do. The last thing they should do is to just sort of take this sort of cavalier approach to their decision not to engage in any kind of planning and not to have any kinds of conversations with their children and say, well, when I'm gone, I'm just gone. They'll have to deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
That's not okay. And the reason I say it's not okay is because that's not how you've lived your life. That's not how you've raised your children. That's not how you want them to function. That's not how you want them to raise your grandchildren. That's not how you were successful in your career. It's just not
Mm-hmm.
a thing that you've ever done. And the consequences can be dire to the family when even if you, have a plan and you name one child to be your trustee or to be your executor or to be your power of attorney, if you become disabled, don't get me started on powers of attorney and avoiding disability
Mm-hmm.
court with this little simple document, but are setting them up for being the lightning rod for everybody else who's
Right.
looking at them for answers they just don't have. And that's not fair. And this is happening when you're disabled and when you're deceased and you're the leader of the family. So, by definition, there's no leader. They are helping them through this
Mm-hmm.
and they're grieving. What do you think is uh, the do you think that there's an increased probability that your family will not be as strong going into the future past this mess you left
Hmm.
than if you hadn't left it.
It certainly is a very important reminder. And if we take it back to the Stoics, the subject of mortality is a hard one, but as Seneca wrote in his letters to his friend, people die once, we have to do it properly. We have to prepare for it. And to your point, we have to make sure that the person who lived their life supporting being the leader of the family should not leave their family worse off when they go.
Yeah, and I don't think that people feel better by not doing planning, right? Just do it for yourself, right?
Mm,
You're going to feel better. You know this is something you should do.
right.
You know that, it's something, it's unfinished business.
Hmm.
And you know, one of a lot of times if I have young clients, younger families, a lot of times, they'll say, "Well, I'm building my business. I'll deal with estate planning later." And I have a young family, young kids, and stuff. And I'm just like, "Yeah, that's fine, but won't you feel better if you do it? Right? If you've got these young kids, and every day you're kind of like, there's got this little nagging
Hmm.
feeling that you haven't done everything you possibly could do." You haven't said that you don't want your parents to take care of your children if something happened to you, but yet and still, that's exactly what's going to happen,
Hmm.
right? If you die, you haven't done any planning for them. You'll feel better if you do it. And I think that's true when you're, especially, I mentioned the young family for a specific reason, and that is because one of the reasons why they postpone doing the planning is because they're so busy planning other things.
Right.
They're so busy building their businesses and things like that. But I really am of the opinion, and this is from having lived a long time myself and having done stuff, I've never lived under a rock. And that is that the propulsion forward
Hmm.
requires comfort where you are, right? You can do more by having crossed T's and dotted
Hmm.
I's, to take care of important matters that would create some sense of drag on your momentum that you can get rid of to the extent that that drag is caused by your uh, realization that you should be doing some planning, but your refusal to do it.
Certainly. A very important message, and hopefully this episode will help more people to think about it and take the much needed action. Linda, it's been absolutely wonderful having you join us today. So thank you for coming and thank you for your time.
Thank you. I really appreciate your invitation, and I've enjoyed talking to you.
I think there's some issue with the interface on my side, but we will stop the recording from this point. So I might just need to reload. Give me 1 second.
Okay.